Well, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to, have this recording and have this podcast. It's really an honor. And so my name is Patrick Pelagi. I'm the founder of a company called Pro Diabetics, which is an initiative to help people with type 1 diabetes, get the best out of their lives and, fulfill athletic dreams and make personal records. And I'm also making a little documentary which is connected to this initiative. And the premise of the documentary is that there's a there's this person, a young person, a young man who realizes that this child may inherit a rare condition from him, and he does everything he can to ensure that the child's future is in bright hands. So I think the 21st century is a time when we are capable of realizing things that we have not been able to do so before. I'm thinking of like realizing what genetic components may be part of us that can lead to unexpected or interesting results in the future generations. Perhaps that's not the right terminology, but I just use that, so we're all with it. And the idea is that through creating certain kind of solutions, one can, battle nature if they are willing to do so, and they can rise above their current circumstance, so that they can better their own life and their the lives of many others. And so it's a truth seeking journey that I like to think I'm on, and that involves forming a team, that involves hard work, and that involves sometimes facing questions that I myself do not know the answer to. So in those times, I try to think about these as much as possible. Sometimes I ask friends, sometimes I ask people of certain relevance in the sphere. Sometimes I go on social media and reach out to others, and sometimes when I'm really stuck or I feel like this is the time to ask for experts' guidance, then I go for the specific emails. And you have been one of the lucky chosen few who have received an email from me, which was about the future of company forming and the future of initiatives and what it means to create something valuable.
Right.
So I'd like to make this interview about that. And it is so fitting that we have this conversation with you because I see you as an expert and a legend.
I'm not even dead. I'm not even dead. How can I be a legend?
I don't know. A living legend. What can I say? So yeah, but you had wonderful interviews in the past. You interviewed Peter Thiel live on stage in Budapest, which I had the chance to attend, which was fantastic. Congratulations again. And I read your posts and the blogs, so I know you are interested in scientific heresies as well, and a certain kind of thinking that makes people have new perspectives. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if I can, get the opportunity to get a new perspective while, exchanging an interview conversation through email, and you were generous enough to offer a podcast invitation. So here we are.
Okay, so let's begin.
All right. So my first question would be this. I have this belief. So 1 second. So I have this belief that I can help people. And I'm in a certain position when, investors are willing to talk to me about a solution I began to create to better the lives of people. And I'm almost always asked what the company's differentiating advantage is. And I'm aware that a form of advantage can be branding, the team, and other things, but I'm more focused on the proprietary technology for this question. The reason why this question is puzzling to me is because I believe, perhaps rightly so, that the knowledge to create great solutions in great companies is democratized. And the opportunity to act on one's desire to help the world, certainly with the computer software, is becoming more and more of a reality, even for those who live in remote places. So, given that the differentiating advantage would be something that future and present competitors do not have or realize easily, I'd like to pose a question to you. What do you think the philosophical foundation should be for a differentiating advantage for proprietary technology?
Well, the answer I'm going to give you might sound a little almost banal, but I think if you look at the way in which intellectual property rights work within the law, one of the things that's very noticeable about, especially if we're talking about patents, is that they are temporary, right? And there's a reason for that, right? So in other words, the kind of exclusive proprietary ownership over some kind of innovation is temporary, 5 to 7, 10 years, whatever. Sometimes it's renewable, usually it's not. And the principle behind that is precisely as you were suggesting in your question, which is that in a sense, for any kind of new technology that makes a kind of competitive advantage in the marketplace, the person who came up with it isn't the only person who could have come up with it, right? Someone else could have come up with it. And so from that standpoint, then it becomes quite important that opportunity remains open, as it were, so that the advantage that you have by getting a patent is always a temporary advantage, so that others can start to enter the marketplace and perhaps, outcompete you, right, in the product that you're doing and so forth. So you don't have a kind of permanent ownership of the thing. And I think that does reflect the premise of your question, namely that there are always many more people who could be innovators than in fact are innovators. And we actually need a legal regime that, as it were, allows enough fluidity in the marketplace so that those new innovators can enter. And so that's why intellectual property rights tend to be quite limited. It's for that reason. And I think so in that regard, intellectual property law is sort of already on your wavelength.
Mm-hmm. And so we're gonna go into the next question, which is about reasons. And one of the reasons why I find this important is because there's this dominant belief that technology creation is about precedent setting. And in a sense, every big moment in the history of technology can and has only happened once. So in a sense, one could make the mistake and assume that there are no role models to follow. What do we do then, right? So I take it that you advocate for seeing people of the past as if they were our contemporaries, and that one should view the history as a depository of unrealized ideas.
Yes.
Can you expand on this, please?
Yeah, let me get into
Retro-Futurism?
that. Shall I get into? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Because one of the things that does happen. So in the answer to your first question, I was talking about the limitations of intellectual property rights. But of course, the fact that intellectual property rights, strictly speaking, are limited doesn't mean that certain companies that happen to get there first for a certain product, certain innovation, it doesn't follow that they won't end up monopolizing the market anyway, right? And there's been a lot of cases of that kind of thing. And in the history of technology, we call that path dependency, where as it were, the innovator becomes a kind of anchor point that ends up determining what happens. And so as a result, a lot of potential competitors who may have been present at the beginning, right? So you go back into the history and you look at for any given innovation, right? Whether we're talking about the automobile or the steam engine or the cotton gin or, the telephone, right? Whatever, right? Even the internet, right? There were always alternative models that were there at the beginning. And then what happens is one comes to dominate and the others just disappear. But the others that disappear actually typically had their own kinds of virtues to them, right? Had they been realized, would have made, in fact, a rather different future. And so, in a sense, this idea that you alluded to at the end of your question, retro-futurism, right, is this idea of going back to the past and looking at those unrealized beginnings, right? Where there was, so if you think of every innovation, again, you think of just about the automobile, right? It wasn't just Henry Ford, right? Henry Ford came to dominate the market, and not only the market for the cars, but the market for how the cars were produced, how they were sold, and everything else connected with cars, right? But the point was there were a lot of other people there at the beginning in the 1890s. And if you go back and you look at what those guys were up to and how they envisaged the future of the automobile back then, you realize that there could have been many different sorts of futures. And, when you go through history, so now let's say we're talking about the automobile, And we're now what, 130, 140 years since the first automobile. People are rethinking, right? This is a technology, and obviously Elon Musk is somebody rethinking it, right? But the point is, with all of these technologies, a time comes when people sort of realize, well, maybe we ought to think about what is this technology really about? What is it doing? We need to go back to fundamentals in some kind of way. And then how do you go back to fundamentals? Well, actually, the most straightforward way of doing it is to go back to the original history and look at the possibilities that were not realized at the time. And that's where history can actually be an incredible aid to futuristic thinking. And it's unfortunate that it's not used that way. Though a lot of the sort of better science fiction writers are aware of this. But I think from the standpoint of the kind of the normal futurists, it seems to me there is much too much of a tendency on the part of normal futurists to be, as it were, extrapolationists, right? People who are saying, we're in some sense, we've got a trend already going on, and now we just got to figure out, which way the arrow is going, right? Rather than thinking, well, no, maybe there's a different starting point, right, that we can reach back to, which would then lead to a different trajectory. And I think that the history it provides, the ultimate source of ways of kind of thinking about those alternative futures.
That's inspiring, I think. Yeah. And I think it is true in the past, and it's true in the present, and it's going to be true in the future, that value is something that we seek to create. And I'd like to ask you about value creation at this point. So Eric Ries, the originator of the lean startup movement, says that the power of software is limited only by your imagination, and that it is really the imagination made tangible. Any other business has physical constraints, but software really doesn't, which is a rare thing. And he says that because of this, the leverage that an individual can have compared to any other time in history is truly astonishing. He also advocates that the great innovator should adapt a certain kind of methodology that will better enable a company to thrive. Specifically, he advocates that the unit of progress should be changed from making things to validated learning. And by this, one could minimize the mistakes that happen when allocating the resources and refine the development of the product. So in this sense, learning is a key to value creation. I'd like to pose a question about this. Can you tell me more about the proactionary imperative, which is something I would argue is necessary for both learning and value creation, and how can one position themselves to be ready for the challenges that knowledge creation comes with?
Well, okay, so this is kind of a little bit complicated. So let me take it apart a bit and deal with it that way. First of all, the business about validated learning that you were raising, I think is very good. It's a very good one, and I think one of the things that we sort of don't. This is not as straightforward as it sounds, though. Okay, so. I think, in fact, a lot of the learning that happens, because a lot of learning happens just simply because we're always getting feedback from what we're doing, right? So that the prospects for learning are always with us. The problem is that the learning doesn't stick. So in other words, validated learning implies some kind of a sense of collective memory, right? Which is the reason why, if you have validated learning, you don't have to constantly be reinventing the wheel. Okay. And I think the problem at the moment is that we have a lot of learning in a sense of a lot of feedback, right? And people can respond, as it were, to that quite quickly, but nothing sticks, right? And this becomes a bigger problem in our own time, I would say, because the sort of corporate entities that would normally be the repositories of the kind of validated learning, right, aren't as permanent as they are anymore. I mean, just think of an ordinary company, right? Very often, if you've got a company that's full of employees who have been doing what they're doing for a very long time, it's a kind of collective learning project, right, where people are committed to it and they're sharing information constantly and they're building upon it and everything. And very often the company's brand, the company's name, the company's reputation would be very much bound up with that kind of knowledge capital that is part of the corporate property of the company. But you see, companies don't really exist like that anymore. People aren't sticking around long enough, right? They're not permanent members. Everybody is just, hot desking it, you might say. And so the idea of validated learning, right, where does it happen, right? How is it preserved, right? So there's a real kind of issue here about, the embodiment, you might say, of validated learning in today's world, right? So there is, and that's kind of a sociological problem, I would say, right? Because we're ultimately talking about how the learning is consolidated and shared, right, and preserved over time so that many people can actually benefit from it. So it's a kind of a sociological problem about knowledge. It's, very central to the kinds of things I'm generally interested in under the rubric of social epistemology, okay? So that's kind of what I think about the validated learning stuff, which I think is a good concept, right? It's a good concept, but it's easier said than done in today's world. Now, with regard to the proactionary business, I think for your listeners, the relevant way of thinking about this is that you might say, in today's world, right, where I think everybody agrees that the world is kind of more open-ended than ever before, more uncertain than ever before, right, that a lot of the things that people have taken for granted in the past as being true can no longer be taken for granted. And so then what this does is it kind of, you might say, as a baseline, the level of risk in the world is higher. Okay, at least at a psychological level, right? People perceive the world to be riskier, right? It's very hard to quantify this in any kind of objective way, but it's certainly quite clear that the way in which people operate, right, presupposes that we live in a kind of risky world. And risk opens itself to two rather different interpretations. Now, one interpretation about risk is that risk is a threat, right? That the uncertain world is full of danger, right? And in some sense, one wants to minimize uncertainty, right? And minimizing uncertainty means we've got control over the situation. And people who think about things this way, right, I associate with a precautionary attitude, right? Precautionary, which is a term that's used very much in environmental law, for example, and in medicine as well, the do no harm principle, right? Where, so in other words, if there is a significant chance that some harm might be done, regardless of the level of benefit, don't do it, right? And that's the precautionary principle. And like I say, it's very strong in environmental policy in particular. But the other attitude, which is the one that you were raising, which is associated with me, is the proactionary attitude. And the proactionary attitude treats risk as an opportunity, right? Very much in the way an entrepreneur, would treat uncertainty. I mean, the thing about entrepreneurship, right, is that it works best in a space where no one's dominant, where in a sense no one really knows what the market is, and so as it were, that openness, right, that indeterminacy of what the market is really about allows for all kinds of imaginations to be projected on it, and of course one then becomes the market leader and dominates, okay? And again, we were talking about earlier about the automobile, and you could think about any kind of innovation. Again, think about computers, the internet, right? There were always several prototypes out there operating in what you might say is an indeterminate space where it could have gone any way, and then it went one way, right? One entrepreneur cornered the market. Right? Now, you don't get to that position unless you have a proactionary attitude, which means you have to be open to risk, you have to welcome risk, and you have to take chances. Now, taking chances, right, from an epistemological standpoint, right, is basically about experimenting, right? You have to have a strong experimental kind of animus in order to have the proactionary kind of attitude. And that's very important because if you look at the rise of modern science, okay, modern science is rightly most connected with experimental attitude. And what does the experimental attitude amount to in this context? What it amounts to is to probing nature in ways that it hadn't been probed before, right? I mean, the whole point about doing an experiment, which is why experiments happen in laboratories and other sorts of artificial spaces, is that you actually put a natural phenomenon under unnatural conditions, right? So in other words, you sort of change the normal, you change the certain, right? And you bring it into a space of uncertainty deliberately to see how it will respond. And that is the way you learn, right? That is the way you learn. That is how you learn something new. And the more surprising the outcome, right, the better the result, right? And that is the best kind of learning, right? Where you are surprised that you didn't think this would work, but it does. And then you try to figure out, why does it work? And that then leads you down the path of science, you see? And that is how you might say you kickstart the sort of validated learning process that we were talking about earlier, right? It starts with this kind of probing attitude to the world, right? Where you end up finding out something you didn't know before, so you're actually learning something at a genuine level, and then you try to deepen that learning by finding out, why did that surprising thing happen? Now, you see, if you look at guys like, from Francis Bacon in the 16th century to Karl Popper in the 20th century, that's what these guys are talking about under the name of science. And it involves a proactionary attitude toward the world. So that's how I would put these things together.
That's perfect, because my next question is actually about science. So we're going to lead up to that. So as I said, there's this view that technology is about precedent setting, and therefore it takes us from 0 to 1, whereas science relies largely or perhaps entirely on repeatable experiments, right? And that it starts with the extrapolation and the potential discovery of a pattern. Okay? And so this reminds me of Peter Thiel's idea, which is that science is fighting a two-front battle against excess skepticism and excess dogmatism. The reason why I believe this is important, because innovators are almost always, by definition, dealing with a problem where there's no guarantee of a solution, like you mentioned. And this means they are operating under extreme uncertainty, and in a sense, innovators have to improvise to put contours to an uncertain space. Mm-hmm. So and this is interesting because I know you mentioned this before in one of your podcasts. I'm raising attention to Plato now. So where Plato once highlighted the responsibility of playwriters and the power of imagination, I'd like to argue that there is another form of theater that could serve as an inspiration for modern-day innovators. And it is improvised theater, or improv, which is a form of theater where no actor has a script, and yet they all make a conscious and dedicated attempt to amaze and entertain. What is your take on the power to improvise, and how do you think one could get better at it?
Well, let me tell you, first of all, I don't know if you know this, but my most recent book, which is about the future of the university, and basically going back to sort of the founding values of the modern university in the early 19th century, which was the period of Kant and Hegel and all these great German idealist philosophers, and I talk a lot about what teaching is, right? And it's in this context, actually, I make a big deal about improvisation, because I think improvisation is basically at the core of good teaching, because what you have to do when you teach is you have to, there's a sense in which you already, if you're an educator, you know, as it were, your subject matter. But then you have this kind of new audience, right? The student audience, who aren't as educated as you are. In fact, they might even know very little of anything, right? But nevertheless, it's your job somehow to make this stuff that you know alive to them. And you just can't, as it were, repeat it to them as you know it yourself, right? Because that's not going to get through them at all. This is why students these days don't read books, right? Is because, in a sense, the books are written for the people who are already educated. But if you're not already educated, it's pretty hard to see how you're going to get there by reading a book, right? What you need is someone who's able to translate it, right? And so improvisation is a certain kind of way of translating ideas into the context, right? And the context is very often one into which you are thrown, right? And that's the thing that makes it, improvisation very exciting as a form of theater, right? You never quite know, right, what's coming, right? And so very often when improvisation is done, right, you have the actors go on the stage, and then they're being told from the audience, tell me about this in this style, right? Or do this in this way, right? And then boom, in 5 seconds they begin. Teaching is a lot like this when it's successful, because what you're doing is you're sort of looking at your audience, you have some sense of what they're like, and then you're translating the idea in a way that they can then run with it, right? Because if you actually inspire your students, right? You actually get them interested in the ideas that might actually take them to the books, right? That might actually take them to, where the knowledge is in a more formalized kind of way. But you need that jumpstart moment. And that's where improvisation really becomes very handy as a kind of teaching device. And this is why, for example, I think, PowerPoints are for lip syncing monkeys, right? It is not a form of education, right? Because PowerPoint just kills the whole improvisational character of education. Because basically it takes for granted that, education is a content delivery service, a bit like Deliveroo, right? Only for knowledge. And it seems to me that this just completely defeats the point of you might say the magic of education, right? Of bringing alive ideas into young people. And the thing that's really crucial about that from the standpoint of innovation, right? Because is that that the people in your audience, the vast majority of them, aren't going to be doing what you're doing as the teacher, right? You as the teacher who, let's say, knows chemistry or physics or English literature or philosophy or whatever, right? That your students aren't going to be like you, right? But they might nevertheless get something out of your ideas if you convey them properly, right? And what that means with the improvisation is it's almost like, you're throwing a ball and they can catch it, right? And so they can participate in the idea creation process as it is happening in the classroom. And then once the class is over, they can take it to wherever they go, right? And do with it whatever they will in whatever new and amazing ways. And so very often when you actually sort of deconstruct all of these great innovations from the past, you realize that in fact the innovator picked up an idea from this professor or from this book or something, and then they really made something out of it, right? Whereas, with the professor, it just remained as a kind of theoretical entity or something like that, right? That the innovator was able to in some way, have it roll around in his mind and then turn it into something real. And you see, this is why, so improvisation is incredibly important to sort of jumpstart the creative process, especially in the kind of academic setting, I would say. So I'm very, very much in favor of it. But unfortunately, the way we evaluate, higher education, especially these days, really cuts against it. It really discourages people from doing it. But that is, in fact, I think, where the spark is, where the creative spark is that sort of links academic knowledge to the kind of more practical knowledge that innovators are generally interested in.
Well, I can tell that you must love improvising.
That's why I'm talking to you. I just come in here and I just got a couple of questions and I'm just making it up as I go along.
Absolutely. And it's one of the most fun things one can ever do.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be my final question before we leave. And it is about truth.
All right.
So I have this belief that truth is like water in the sense that it finds a way through the obstacles ahead of it. And recognizing that the path of truth is not a linear path, and there are moments when innovators have to, face obstacles and find ways around it. Well, I would say that one of the ways to go around an obstacle is a leap forward that is initiated by a breakthrough solution. And so this question is about truth and breakthrough solutions. So I'm really interested in how one can arrive to the next level of this breakthroughs. And I see two options that necessitates a breakthrough. It is either indefinite perseverance or making a pivot, which is an analogy to basketball, where one foot is firmly rooted in what we learned, and we are changing one foot at a time. But the problem is, no matter which option one decides to go with, the breakthrough is not predictable. So in a sense, the best we can do is to keep being prolific in our efforts to solve the problem and continue to expand our imagination. And this reminds me of Kierkegaard's Night of Faith idea, where by virtue of believing, almost impossible things can happen. So what beliefs or ideas from religion do you think could serve the modern day innovators?
Well, I guess one of the things to start with this Kierkegaard thing you ended with, is that our notion of what is possible and impossible has changed over time. I think that's an important point to keep in mind, right? And in fact, I would say that if you want to have a kind of category of statement that is always wrong, it's this is impossible, right? Right? That statement, any statement that says X is impossible is bound to be wrong. Okay? And so then the question becomes by virtue of what? Why is it always wrong? And I think it's because our notions of what we think is possible usually presuppose certain, you might say, constraints or fixed things about the world, right? Certain things about reality that we know to be true, regardless of whatever else we don't know, we know this is true, right? And so we have these kinds of fixed views, and these fixed views then circumscribe what we take to be possible, right? That's usually how it goes. And then we do science or experiments or whatever to find out within what's possible, what's actual, right? That's normally the way the metaphysics works on this. However, it may be that a lot of the stuff that provides these constraints on what's possible aren't necessary, right? So in other words, the constraints might themselves be ones that we just have imposed for traditional reasons, not because they're sort of, hardwired into the world, but because they might be hardwired into our cultural traditions or hardwired into even to our scientific traditions, right? So in other words, it's part of our thinking, that our thinking in some sense is preventing us from actually expanding our sense of what is possible. And so if you look at the great revolutions in science, for example, very often one of the characteristics is that the innovator, let's say, for example, Einstein with regard to Newtonian mechanics, what he does is he basically suspends an assumption that Newton and all the physicists for 200 years had taken as given, namely the absolute nature of space and time. Okay, so that was seen as part of that bedrock of reality that constrains what's possible, right? Now, with the advent of non-Euclidean geometry in the 19th century, and so mathematics historically has played an incredibly important role in loosening up people's sense of what's possible, because non-Euclidean geometry basically comes up with alternative ways of configuring space and time, right, which allows for various kinds of relativity to occur, right, and so once you've got kind of a kind of conceptual apparatus that gets you to think, as it were, outside of the box you're in, and like I say, mathematics is the best instrument we've got for that, to be honest, then you can start loosening up some of these assumptions that you've always thought, were built into the world. And that's basically what Einstein did, right? And what Einstein discovered, and this is what makes it a scientific revolution, is that you can loosen some of those constraints that we had been taken for granted, and the world is still coherent, right? The world doesn't fall apart. And not only that, we could start thinking about our world as in fact part of a bigger world that we hadn't been thinking about before, right? And so this is why Einstein's theory of relativity is so important for understanding how you could do space travel, right? And how you could actually think about are having, not just a kind of a telescopic relationship to the cosmos, but one where we might actually be able to travel there in some way, right? And how the spaceships would need to be designed and, in order to be able to obey the kinds of laws that Einstein introduces into physics, okay? Now, you see, that's a great example of where, as it were, our horizon of what we think is possible was really opened up by suspending an assumption that we thought we had to have, right? And so now the thing is, obviously you cannot just suspend every assumption that we have, right? Because then you would get into a kind of incoherent world. So there's a kind of art to this, you might say. And so it's not like, I have some kind of magic formula or something, but you have to, when you think about all the things that we take for granted that we think constrain the possible, we should test each of those assumptions individually and say, do we really need to assume this? Do we really need to assume this? Do we really need to assume this? And you might find that if you don't assume one of these things, that in fact a whole new world opens up. And so that would be kind of my general view about this, because in fact this is how, revolutionary breakthroughs have taken place in science in the past.
Absolutely. It's that kind of first principle thinking, and then that leads to new discoveries and new principles even.
Yeah.
So with that said, Professor, I want to end on this highlight that Eric Ries says. The future of our society and the economic growth of our industrialized countries is going to depend on the quality and character of our collective imaginations. And Professor, I just like to say that you have expanded the imagination of me and my friends. And I wish you the best of luck for the upcoming books and projects of yours. And keep up the good work. And I hope we stay in touch.
Yes, indeed. Well, you have a good day there, Patrick, and say hello to your friends for me, all right?